welcome. My name is Esther Turcios. I'm the Legislative Policy Manager for the Colorado Fiscal Institute. I'm joined tonight by our Senior Economist, Chris Stiffler. Welcome, ambassadors, to the CFI Tax Ambassador course. We're really excited to get you all to join this effort, learn more about our taxes from 4 of our staff members here at CFI. Tonight, Chris and I will be going through a canned presentation that CFI has put together, talking about how we can reshape our tax code for racial justice. We hope that this presentation gives you an idea of how we present, the information that we use, how we try to lead with values when we do our presentations, give you an idea of how we do this work, just so it can serve as a resource, as inspiration, as you put your presentations or projects together. So we will jump right into the presentation. So thank you all again for joining us today. We, many of you, I'm sure, have been in front of screens and on Zooms a lot, so we appreciate your time. You all joined this webinar today because you care about creating a better Colorado, where regardless of your race, your skin color, your income, we really believe that everyone should have access to the things that help create healthy and thriving lives and communities. And, whether that's a quality education, affordable and quality housing, the ability to save for college, retirement, financial stability, access to parks and open spaces, anything that helps us to lead thriving lives should be accessible to anyone. And the opportunity for a high quality of life is really possible when everyone has a chance to get ahead and improve our lives. And these are really the values that should be inherent, right, in our state and in our country. Everyone is supposed to be able to build something for themselves, their families, their communities. As a CFI, as a tax policy organization, but most importantly, as Coloradans trying to live healthy and thriving lives, we really believe that our tax system plays a really powerful role in creating those thriving communities and in the fight for racial justice. And we can't reshape tax policies if we don't understand them. Tax policy isn't an easy subject to talk about. And if we don't have the space to learn about the history of taxes, how Colorado and this country as a whole have used taxes to create more opportunities for a healthy life for some group of people, while many others have been left out, we won't learn it anywhere else. So we hope that this presentation, as I mentioned earlier, really serves as just a learning opportunity to take a look at the past history of taxes, how they're impacting us today in the present, and how we can change our tax policies for a better future. When we think of public investments at CFI, we think of the taxes that you pay that play a role in helping people, families, and communities live thriving and prosperous lives. We think of things like quality education, affordable housing, access to public transportation, healthcare, parks and open spaces, many, many other things. But we really have to ask ourselves, does everyone have the same access to these things? Is everyone able to have a good quality of life regardless of their race, their income, if they have a disability or not? Are we living up to these values? Is everyone able to live a quality and healthy life? And unfortunately, we know from lived experience, we know from data, we know from studies that in the pandemic today alone, right, all clearly show that access to public investments that help us lead these healthy lives have not been made accessible to people of color, immigrants, people who earn low and moderate incomes, people with disabilities, and many, many other oppressed groups. And if we take a look at something like education, for instance, we can see that Colorado schools are failing many students, particularly students of color. So to throw some numbers at you, Colorado ranks 39th amongst all 50 states in per student funding. So meaning how much money we give to each school per student. Colorado ranks 50th in starting salary for our teachers. So we have the largest gap between starting salaries for teachers compared to the average salaries of other occupations in our state. The gap in outcomes in math and reading achievement between white kids and kids of color in Colorado is also among the highest in the country. There's a lot of other statistics in this way. Such an important public investment, right? Public education, and we are failing so many of our students. The same is true if we talk about access to a college education, the ability to be successful after graduation. Today, students and their families are paying more out of pocket for college than what they receive in aid from the state. Colorado families used to pay just about a third of the cost of college, and the state would pick up the other 2/3. And now over time that's flipped. So Colorado has the 6th fastest increase in average tuition at 4-year colleges. Tuition is almost 70% more expensive in 2018 than it was in 2008. If we look at data by race, we know that Black students are more likely to have debt, carry more of it, take a longer time to pay off, and are more likely to default on loans. And that's, again, because we know that for Black students, the ability to access student loans is already difficult, and they have a much harder time paying those loans off post-graduation. So when we make cuts to higher education, it means college becomes more unaffordable for students and their families. So it's important to look at these terrible statistics and realities when thinking about leading healthy lives, economic prosperity, because it's not about whether or not people, in particular people of color, want to go to well-funded schools and want to have access to affordable and quality education. It's about the barriers that they face to access these things. And this is directly tied to our values around taxes and how we use them. So taxes and our ability to fund public investments are really a function around who pays the taxes, how different taxes are distributed among those who pay them, and finally, what those taxes end up paying for that really lead to people of color's access to widespread economic prosperity. So we really have to think about the values that we set on our tax system, on our tax code, when creating policies and how they'll impact different communities. And the reason we associate such negative feelings towards taxes and the reason people of color face so many barriers to economic prosperity is really rooted in the racist history of tax policy. It's by no coincidence that Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian folks, and other people of color face more barriers to economic prosperity than white folks. If we take a look at this country and our state's history, when making tax policy decisions, we can see that there were intentionally racist state and local tax laws that were implemented to ensure that people of color especially couldn't benefit from all the public goods that taxes pie that we all contribute to so that we can all benefit from. And as you can imagine, there are many examples that we can look at historically, nationally, at the state level. So for instance, we know that many of the first tax limitations, specifically laws that limited the amount of money that white people paid, come from Southern states. So after the Civil War, for instance, in 1875 and 1901, Alabama passed property tax limits during their constitutional conventions, specifically to protect white property owners from paying high property taxes. Again, the intention behind this was that they wouldn't pay higher property taxes to fund public schools, their local public schools, because they didn't want to fund the schools where Black students were attending. Another example is in 1932, Mississippi became the first state in the country to pass a sales tax with the explicit intention of limiting, again, the taxes paid by white landowners and shifting that responsibility of who paid taxes onto Black community members. And so many of these states, and they saw how much money that raised. And so really, again, trying to shift that responsibility to another group of folks who had little else to tax. They were, Black folks were owning property at the time. And so shifting that responsibility to the Black folks to pay taxes on the goods that they were able to buy. And many of these types of laws, and are embedded in state laws across the country. These are just a few of the many policies passed years ago that have played a significant role in people of color's ability to be economically prosperous. And as time has passed, we've seen many tax laws just here in the state of Colorado, even really recently, that have really created an upside down tax code that specifically impacts, folks who earn low incomes, people of color. And so I'll pass it off to Chris here to show a little bit of a few examples of the impacts of these decisions here in our state.
So when we talk about our tax code, we always use the term upside down, a simplified way to kind of explain a complicated term called regressivity or progressivity in taxes. So I want to kind of explain that from an economics perspective. Right here in my graph is households by quintile. Basically what that means is we line up all households from the household that earns the least to the household that earns the most, and then we divide them into fifths or 20%. And so like the bottom 20% in Colorado last year, if you made less than 22,000, you fell into that bottom quintile. Then you have the second quintile between 22 and 40,000, and the middle quintile is between about 40 and 65,000. And we also broke off the top 15%, 4%, and top 1%. And on these bars represents what percentage of your household that you pay in state and local taxes. So that's a summation of income taxes, sales taxes, and property taxes. And when we say the trend is regressive, it's downward sloping, where you can see that people in higher incomes pay a lower percentage of their household income than, say, a household earning the minimum wage, or one of those households in like the bottom 2 quintiles. So look at the quintile, second quintile, that's paying 9% of their household income in state and local taxes. That's some household that's earning about $30,000. They're paying 9%, where someone who's in the top 1% in Colorado is only paying 6.5% in state and local taxes. And understanding why this trend is a big part of our presentation, and it's a big part of the learning of this presentation. So the big downward trend comes on the next slide, where we take the same exact quintiles that I just described, but I broke out the sales tax portion. So the earlier slide showed you all taxes, income, sales, and property taxes. This only looks at the component that is sales tax. And so Colorado has a heavy reliance on sales taxes. We have particularly high local sales taxes. So in Denver, the sales tax is almost 9%. There's a lot of communities across Colorado that, they're in the 8, 9, 10% sales tax region. That's pretty high sales tax compared to the rest of the state. And what's important to understand about sales tax is it's one of the most regressive forms of taxation, meaning it puts a bigger burden on lower income households than upper income households. And what that means is, as a percentage of your household income, that person in the lower percentage, that person making minimum wage, pays about 6% of their household income in sales taxes, where someone who's in the top 1%, when they save a lot more of their money, they buy a lot more services, which tend to not have sales tax. And so as a trend, sales tax takes a lot higher percentage of lower income households' budgets than does upper income households. And so the overall trend is very regressive. The big part of that regressivity is that really punitive sales tax, the regressive nature of the sales tax. The next slide takes those same quintiles we've been talking about, but also breaks them down by race. And so the first bar there represents our data, all our taxpayers in this data. Of all those taxpayers, they are 75% white and 18% either Latinx or Black. And then we've broken out those quintiles by race, and you can see that if you're in the first 2 quintiles, you're much more likely to be a taxpayer of color, whereas if you're in the higher quintiles, you're much likely to be a white taxpayer. And what that means is our regressive nature of our tax code even more disproportionately hurts taxpayers of color. They're more likely to fall into those quintiles that pay a higher percentage of their household income in state and local taxes. And white taxpayers are more likely to fall into those categories that pay a lower percentage of their household income in state and local taxes. Next slide. So we talk about our ability to adjust the tax code, as Esther talked about earlier, a way of driving making thriving communities and advocating through the tax code. But one of the things we passed last year in 2020 on the ballot, or on the bottom of the ballot, was Prop 116. We look at that as a way of the wrong way to go. Prop 116 broadly cut the income tax. So in Colorado, we have a flat income tax. We're like one of 8 states that have a flat income tax, which means we don't really balance out how regressive our sales tax is by getting a progressive income tax, like say other states like California does. Since we have a flat income tax, we can't balance out how regressive our sales taxes are. But we've made it actually worse this year with passing Prop 116. We broadly based cut the income tax rate from 4.63 to 4.55. And when you broadly based cut the rate, that gives a lot of the tax break to the people who have the wealth in the state. And so if you break it out by people who make more than $500,000, they represent less than 1% of taxpayers in Colorado, but they got more than about 21% of the tax cut. They basically got the same amount of tax cut as the bottom 70% of taxpayers. So we use the idea of broadly based cutting the rate as a bad way to fix that upside down tax code. Next slide. There are better ways to do it. And what we do is we look at other states that have a more progressive, or they don't have an upside down tax code like we do. Vermont comes to mind. So if you look at Vermont's quintiles compared to Colorado's quintiles, ours goes down as you get higher income. Vermont's actually gets more progressive. So they grab more of their revenue, things like parks and roads and colleges and higher education and Medicaid, from upper income earners. And 3 biggest differences between Colorado and Vermont: Vermont has less reliance on sales tax. Vermont has a graduated income tax, so they tax higher income earners at higher rates. And also Vermont has an estate tax, so they do a better job actually taxing wealth. So we look to Vermont as not an upside down code like we have. Another way we modify the tax code is do things like tax credits. Instead of broadly based cutting the rate, we advocate for targeted tax credits. So basically we carve out those people, working families that need it the most. And that's what we did with a lot of the state tax bills that passed in the legislature this year. We beefed up the thing called the earned income tax credit. It basically drives targeted tax relief to families who have children who basically make between, like, really the target audience is like $30,000 to $40,000 households. So those are the ones that are in the lowest quintiles, the ones that pay a higher percentage of their income in state and local taxes. They're the ones getting those targeted tax relief. We also beefed up our child tax credit, another way of driving targeted tax relief to specific families, not broadly based cutting the rate that mostly gives the big chunk of that tax revenue to millionaires, but using a tax code as like a surgeon's knife to really drive targeted tax credits to the people that need them the most right now. Next slide. Yeah. So I'll pass it back to Esther at this point. She's going to tell us about the future, what's on our ballot and the bottom of the ballot this year, so we know what not to. Let's not repeat another Prop 116, and let's drive more policies that are targeted, that benefit the people that really need it the most.
Thanks, Chris. So we talked a lot about history and policy today, but we really hope that what you'll take from all of this is that you hold a lot of power in shaping what Colorado looks like for yourself, for your communities, especially for communities of color. As Chris talked about, Prop 116, that's a ballot measure. So, there are such fundamental ways of making change in our state, whether we get involved at the legislature during the legislative season that starts in January at the Capitol, or, you learn how to make change in your community through starting at the bottom of the ballot. This year there are more than 10 local ballot measures in Denver alone. We're going to see 3 statewide tax-related measures on our ballot. There's so much that we can do. Just learning about what's happening in our state, what's happening locally, what's happening federally. If you haven't been following what's happening federally, there's a lot that you can do to get involved. Follow groups and advocates working on the issues that you care about. Follow CFI if you care about tax policy issues. Join our CFI ambassador program. This is a 6-module train the trainer course that will dive into Colorado's tax code, teach you the ins and outs of Colorado's fiscal constraints, and really just give you the tools that you need to talk to your community about creating a code that works for everyone. So we know it can be daunting to learn about taxes, but they don't have to be scary. They're actually pretty cool to learn about, and you can learn about it in a way that makes sense for you and share that with others. Because like we've shared, there is a way to make change, and as Coloradans, we play a really, really big role in doing that. So making sure that you're getting involved any way that you can, whether it's locally, statewide, or nationally, we invite you to join us in this fight. And so just to wrap things up, tax policy, it's not race neutral. It's not in the past, not today, but it is a really powerful tool that we can all use to achieve racial equity, to make sure that our communities, our families can live thriving, healthy, prosperous lives. So we hope that you follow CFI and engage in this fight with us and learn a little bit more about taxes along the way. Thank you all so much for joining us.